What I wanted to cover today is not just talk a bit about this project, but also talk a bit about how a humanist like me creates and uses quantitative data and the possibilities and challenges that go with that, and also how undergraduate and graduate students have played a role in this, what's worked and what hasn't. One thing I'll say is that usually when I talk about this stuff, I start by doing an extended shout out to the data services team that made all this possible. And so I would just say, assume that is the case. I don't mean to embarrass any of you, but just assume that's the case. All right, so with that said, and I do have a bit of a slideshow that will show some examples of this. I want to tell you a bit about my project and then about the data component of it. I think Bill really captured it. I'm working on what is really a two-piece project about the federal government. I'm currently in a fellowship at the Humanities Center working on it. It's a project that seeks to understand how the federal government operated at the moment of its creation, and understand how the founding fathers conceived of governance on their own terms, not necessarily in the terms we'd use now, but the terms they used. And the question I would start with is, why does this matter? And it matters because think about how often Americans argue about what the founding fathers wanted. Think about how often they say, they wanted a big government, they wanted a small government. Well, I would put a question to you, which is, when they had a federal government, how many people were in it? And if you don't know the answer to that, it's because I don't know the answer either. Nobody knows the answer. And so that's what I'm trying to figure out. And there are going to be two pieces of this. One will be a book I'm writing that's more of a kind of top-down study that's mostly about the founding fathers, about some familiar names: Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Quincy Adams. But the digital component is very much the bottom-up story about who served in the federal government, names you've never heard of. I'll give you some examples as we move along to really tell that story. But it's really easier said than done. I'm happy to talk more about what the project does, the history piece of it, but I actually really want to focus on the data part of it, because I realize we often work with data sets that were created digital. They were born digital, or they migrated pretty easily from print to digital. For what I'm looking at, some of it moves easily, but some of it doesn't. And so that's what I want to talk about. The first thing I want to begin with is there simply is no existing single source that would tell you how many people were in the federal government. The closest we get are a series of registers that were published every other year beginning in 1816. But for the 25-year period before that, for what comes after that, there are still big gaps. And I think the best way to understand how I've tried to grapple with this as a data project, and also to give you a sense of the historical sources, is to walk you through my slideshow. And I thought I would imagine this in terms of people's careers, how people pursued jobs, and then how they got federal jobs, and use that to talk about the data. So with that in mind, I'm going to pull up my slideshow. And I'm in that moment, that Zoom moment when, you're trying to get to do what you want.
And I made you the whole.
I know. So I'm very grateful. So yes, I saw that. Thank you for doing that. All right. So yes, and this is how I always begin. I always have a slide called First Slide. And I thought I'd actually begin by telling you how people tried to get government jobs, because it really captures the challenge. Seeking a job. We've all done it. We've all written cover letters. Here's a cover letter from 1789. Now, it happens to be a particularly difficult one to read, so I'm going to zoom in. And I know this isn't what you were expecting. I want to see if one of you wants to, sort of jump in and try to read any of this. And if you don't, I'm going to call on somebody.
I actually want to try.
Go for it, Doris.
May it.
You're off to a great start.
May it leave your. I don't know what that one is.
All right. May it please your excellence.
Oh, see. Okay.
And it's dated Boston, 18 June, 1789.
Without previous apology, hold on, I gotta minimize.
You're actually doing great.
Or introduction to your excellency, I have taken the liberty to request a few moments of your attention, to a subject which nearly concerns, like I'm having to go back and forth between my full screen. Where am I at? Take a few moments for your attention to a nearly concerns the future.
You're doing better than anyone I know.
Because I'm left-handed and I have illegible writing, as people have told me, so I can read.
And I think we got enough. The point I also want to draw from it is this is an example of what I mean when I say we've got information that isn't necessarily data. Now, if you get to the end of, one thing I will say is the reason I interrupted is it's a long protracted letter that doesn't get to its point until the end. And it's a guy who has a job collecting revenue in Boston, and he just wants to keep the job under the federal government. So it's a letter of application. And this is he's writing it, he writes to George Washington, and it ends here, and it's signed Thomas Melville, Melvil. Sometimes it's spelled with an E. I'll tell you what happens to him eventually. But this is one of approximately 18,000 letters of application and recommendation that were submitted to the federal government during the period of my study. This is an example of something where producing data was really challenging. And I hired a group of undergraduates. The Humanities Digital Workshop created a tool that started organized. They started as microfilm that I got scanned. I then had the HDW create a little data entry tool that worked really well. And then I had a bunch of students who would need to go through, organize these, and try to extract some basic information. Who's the author? Who's the recipient? What's the date? Where's it from? And what's the job? So for example, 8,000 of these are letters. Actually, there are more letters of recommendation than application. There actually are 161 condemnations in this collection of people writing, saying, whatever you don't give this guy a job. But this is the first set of data. This is trying to understand who's trying to get a federal job. And I start with this because this is the most challenging stuff. Full transcription would require a large staff of editors that I just don't have the resource. I don't have the money for it. That's not the kind of project I'm doing. There is even the newer, more sophisticated optical character recognition with handwritten letters won't work with this because it needs several letters by the same person to get familiar with it. These are almost always letters by one person. So this is the first set we've got. So this is how you begin understanding these federal officials, are with their letters of application and recommendation. And these are actually proving really challenging. And if you have questions, I'll walk you through the work process we've used for that. So then let's talk about how these people actually get a job. There's a feature of the Constitution that made this project possible, which is the Senate interpreted the requirement for advice and consent to apply to all federal employees, just about all federal employees. So beginning with on George Washington's literally first day in office, he started sending letters in which he would say, I want this person for this job, that person for that job, and the Senate would vote on them. And they approved them in about 97% of the times. And they did this on everybody except enlisted personnel in the Army and low-level office clerks. And they'll give you an example of how this would appear. These were later published in a collection called the Senate Executive Journal. And here's the record from September 11th, 1789. It's a good example. So Washington sent a letter, or actually his secretary, Tobias Lear, delivered it. And if you look in the middle of the page, he's written, gentlemen in the Senate, I nominate the following. Alexander Hamilton, well, we've all heard of him. Nicholas Everly to be the comptroller, Samuel Meredith to be the treasurer, Oliver Wolcott Jr. to be the auditor, and Joseph Nurse to be the register. And he then nominates a number of other officials. Now, this material fortunately was transcribed by the Library of Congress and converted into machine readable form, nicely tagged, but again, not something that I was able to develop a computational method to extract. So what it meant doing, again, was hiring a bunch of students to go through, we had it in a slightly different format from this, to go through the Senate Executive Journal. We'd highlighted every time words like nominate, appoint, recommend showed up, and they had to extract as much of this as they could, which meant the name of the individual, where they were from, the office, and the date, and then what happened. Was this person approved or not? And there were something on the order of 5,800 of these during the period I'm looking at, but that came out of thousands of pages of text. And it includes, if you look down, it says for surveyor of the District of Rappahannock. These are the guys that interest me. He's a low-level customs official. Now, first in 1792, and then in 1802, and then beginning every other year in 1816, finally, Congress required the government to produce a list of all its employees. And I don't mean finally because that prevented corruption. I mean finally because it made my project easier. And then you get something that works a lot better. So you get a document like this. This is the 1826 register. It shows, John Quincy Adams is the president. He's from Massachusetts. He gets 25 grand a year. It shows then where people are employed. Daniel Brent is the chief clerk of the State Department. He works in Washington, D.C. He's from Virginia and gets $2,000. Now, this kind of document was easy to acquire. It's available online. And then to transcribe. I tried optical character recognition, and that it just didn't work reliably. And you get not just these senior officials, but if you look here, all of the clerks. This is just in the New York Customs House. All of these guys are employed in the Customs House. And using these, every other year, you can finally start tracking what becomes of them, how long they work, what's their tenure in office. There are a lot of other questions I can talk about that one would ask from this. It says where they're born, which is really interesting. Simply looking at names is interesting. What are the naming conventions these people have? One thing that shows up a lot is you get a lot of local customs offices where the chief official has one name, and then there's another guy working there who has Junior as his suffix, and it's clearly his son. And it helps you understand how these people are operating. I want to show you, this was pretty easy to get transcribed. Then the difficult part began, where I tried to have students working on this. They did a good job starting, but I really needed to work on it, which was the disambiguation process. Almost all of these, so everyone in these published records is a white guy. Now, there were women who worked unpaid as lighthouse supervisors there, and they don't show up here. There are a large number of Native peoples who actually support the federal project as allies of the US, but they are not government employees. So what you get are a group of people whose ancestry is predominantly English and Scots-Irish, and as a result, their names are very similar. And then you got to figure out which John Smith is the same as this other John Smith. Thomas Melville is a good example. Here you can see this is what we get as a record for him. So his name is spelled in two different ways, sometimes with an E, sometimes without. He shows up, if you look in the column on the right, on the far right, it has the year of a record for him, the source that it came from. We've got letters of application and recommendation, LAR, SEJ, the Senate Executive Journal, and the registers. And if you look at the jobs he's got, you can say this is almost certainly the same guy. And I could do that confidently. And then, as you can see, the ID is the canonical ID number for him. I've confirmed this is the same guy. He gets a job. He works as a revenue official until about 1830, when he's 80 years old. And that's when Andrew Jackson fires him. But he clearly told his family, this is a good gig. It is a steady paycheck. And it's either his nephew or grandson, Herman Melville, who learns from this. And Herman Melville's first day job, when he's trying to make it as a writer, was to work in the New York Customs House. And he learned it from Thomas Melville. So he's a very clear example, and he's an easy one. Let's use another name, William Clark. Here are all of the entries attached to William Clark. Some of them are spelled with an E. That doesn't mean it's the same guy. Some without an E. Some of these I knew had to be the William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And I've chosen him because I wrote a book about William Clark, so I needed to do this. Now, I'm not showing you all the data. I've got the job titles. There's other additional information, where they're working. And the question is, what information would you need to determine which one is which? Now, some of it is, a consul is a commercial official in a foreign country, and that's very unlikely to be an Indian commissioner. But there's a territorial judge, and well, that could be, and then there's a territorial governor. And this is the kind of thing where you reach the limits of what undergraduates and especially graduate students can, and even graduate students can do definitively. They can do a first run on this, but not a definitive one. And this is where I get dragged into it. So after you look this over, and especially where they're serving is very helpful, this is how it eventually sorts out. There is a William Clark, whose name was spelled with an E and without an E, who served as the US consul in Germany, in the German port towns of Emden and Hanover. And as you can see, we've got him being nominated in the Senate Executive Journal and then recorded in the registers. There is then a William Clark who was a commercial official. He was a boatman, which meant he literally ran the boat that would go to a ship and inspect it when it arrived. And he's also the inspector in St. Mary's, Maryland. There's one who was the treasurer of the US Treasury. He shows up at the bottom. There's one who was a judicial official. He's a US attorney, he's a judge, he's a territorial chief justice. And then there's the William Clark we know of, who was a territorial governor, an Indian official, and he shows up multiple times because every 2 years that register comes out. But this is the process of converting information into data. It doesn't provide a perfect picture of their tenure in office because it doesn't usually record when they've left office. They just sort of disappear from the record, but at least it enables you to do it. And this is the process of determining how they get a job. Now, in the interest of time, I imagine that to many of you, that's the key issue, but I want to go to 2 acronyms that we've been living with: return to work and work from home. None of these guys work from home, but I'm going to use return to work as my silly way to talk a bit about where these people served. And I realize I've got, I apologize, I'm ignoring, there's some funny chats showing up here. The pay scale, what was GS11 paid in 1803? Yeah, well, it records their salary. We can look at that. So I want to look at where these people served, because it's actually a really rich record of that. And what I'm showing you here is basically what Jennifer and Bill were able to do with the data that I had. So I take no credit for this. So the first are a series of cartograms from the 1790s showing where people are serving. And this was an effort to show just how many officials are serving the federal territories. Here is the US as it was in 1790. Here is a cartogram showing that is scaled to the number of adult white males. I chose that because they're the ones who are candidates for these offices. Here is the number of appointees, which, just to go back, you'll see that, for example, Pennsylvania, which has a big population, actually has relatively few federal offices. There just aren't that many in there, and there's a high competition for them. But also, when you then show it next to the federal territories, there actually are, and this is a main point of the project, there's a huge federal presence in the territories because the federal government is doing much of what state governments would be doing otherwise. They're engaged, they manage commerce, they provide militias and things like that. Here are a series of more general maps that shows how the number of federal officials, especially in the Trans-Appalachian West, grows over time. And I realize it looks like some kind of disease vector, but I'm going to skip ahead to some aggregate maps. Again, Jennifer produced these. So here we've got 1792, when the US presence internationally is very limited. It's a small number of commercial officials and diplomats. By 1828, the US has representation in North and South America, Europe and West Asia, North Africa, and in the Western Pacific. Here is a world map. And there you can really see this. Jennifer, again, thank you so much for your help with this. I can see she's there, but we're just not seeing her face. There was a really interesting challenge with this because, here we've got a distant view, but we wanted to geolocate these as accurately as possible. And here are the problems that go along with that. Many of these people are serving in localities that don't exist anymore. And in those cases, you can only go with the counties that they're in because there are better records of that. And even the places in which they served, even if you have officials being appointed in St. Louis, and if you use a contemporary set of GIS data, the dot for St. Louis is the geographic centroid of the city's current boundaries. But in 200 years ago, the city was pretty much limited to what is now the Arch grounds. So over the course of really 2 summers, Bill supported me and a bunch of grad students as we started with the locations we knew about, and then in many cases had to create a distinct georeference and basically move the dot to what the historic government site would have been 2 centuries ago. Now, the final piece of this that I want to show concerns postal delivery. And I want to start here with some general information. As you can see, many civil officials, the number of personnel grows in a limited way, and in some cases goes down. But the number of post offices in the US went up exponentially over this period. And it's mostly as the population dispersal occurred. And one of the things I wanted to do was to map that out, and Bill developed a way to do it. We used Missouri as the case in point. And here's how information becomes data. In the National Archives, and this is illegible to me also, it's a pretty bad scan, are a series of record books from the post office's central office that would record when list each post office and would record when a postmaster was appointed or departed. Don't worry if you can't read it, because beginning in the 1960s, several employees of the National Archives created a preliminary index of this. And this is great because it's and I hired a student to photograph all these. That's what we're looking at. So clearly their process was to take a piece of paper, put it in a typewriter, record the post office, and then as they found additional information, to record it by pen. So here is the St. Louis Post Office and the postmasters of it. This record, I believe, goes up through 1829. So, it's St. Louis County, Rufus Easton, and then Robert Simpson, and then Aaron Gross. And once it was in this form, that was easy to digitize. It was easy to convert this information into data. This was a classic job for a bunch of terrific undergraduate research assistants. Here is the record of Missouri. So we've got a county, we have a locality. Now, some of these localities don't exist anymore. So to map these out, we use the counties. And here's where Bill, using a terrific data set of historic county boundaries, created this. Now you're going to start seeing this. You're going to start seeing post offices getting created by county in the place that became Missouri. And you'll see the years should be advancing. Yes, they are. And you'll see the boundaries of the territory start changing. And it's going to start looking like Missouri. It's going to take a while. It's an interesting little perception test. When does it start to look like Missouri? And you'll notice, as you can see by the color coding, the number of post offices in some counties is starting to grow. There are counties that have none. And this is going to go up to 1833. And that's where I want to stop, and I'm going to make, I said I talked for about 30 minutes. I'm right about there. This is where I'm going to wrap up. Okay, so, all right, we've got this, terrific animation. It's just a series of slides in PowerPoint, but what do we learn from it? Well, first of all, one thing you see is that even by 1833, there are counties with no post offices. So how do people get their mail? Well, there's no delivery at this time. If you want your mail, you have to go to the post office. So if you live in northwestern Missouri, you probably travel once a week, maybe once a month, to the one post office in an adjacent county to get your mail. The other story this tells, though, is that as post offices started appearing in Western counties, that can't happen until the federal government has extinguished native sovereignty in this region. So it's not just a history of the growth of the government, it's a kind of spatial history of the dispossession of principally the Osage. And the Osage have just left southwestern Missouri at this time. They've been forcibly removed into what's now Kansas, and there just isn't a sufficiently large white population to justify a post office. That's one story. The other story is that historians actually are really interested in the post office, and it's an interesting institution. The question is not just why are there so few in those counties, why are there so many? Well, there are a lot in the county that's near Jeff City. That's clearly the central processing area. But the other thing is, once Missouri's a state with 2 members of the Senate and a member of the House of Representatives, they vote on equal terms with everybody else. And so you get what we know happened all the time is that you might get a congressman from New York who said, I want you to vote for the Erie Canal. And the representative from Missouri says, I will only do that if you vote the appropriation to get me more post offices, because that's one thing white settlers really want. They want post offices so that they can be connected both to their families and to other businesses that they're working with. And that's a story we've kind of known anecdotally. Historians have been arguing for that, but we've never really seen it happen. And it's the kind of thing that's only possible by quantifying all of these post offices. That's my final slide. And I'm just going to conclude by saying, net neutrality of the past. Very good, Jennifer. And one so neutral, I'll tell you that much. What I've tried to do today is give you a sense of this project I'm working on, what it is, also talk a bit about why it matters, but especially to talk about the kinds of information sources that I use for this, and then the challenges of converting information in textual form into data that a computer can use, and the kind of labor challenges that go along with that. I should add, there's some data sources for this. There was a terrific collection on officers in the United States Army that I could just send to an external transcriber. I just send to a company that transcribes material. It was in the public domain, and it has a kind of snapshot career profile of every officer in the Army. And that was perfect for that. For some of these other ones that require regular tweaking, that's where working with students worked best. Their accuracy rate was a little lower, but there were daily questions and we could deal with them that way. The other thing I've tried to show are these sort of, I haven't built the website for this yet, so I can't really talk about, I can talk about how this is going to look. I just can't show it. But I did want to use the spatial dimension of it. Again, first of all, to celebrate what Jennifer and Bill had done in supporting this project, but also to show how historians like me, humanists like me, use spatial data to tell a story. I'm going to shut up on that note and, take any questions that any of you have.
I had a question for you, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
No, of course I don't mind.
That's neat. I enjoyed that a lot. When you were talking about the Indian dispossession, have you mapped where trading posts were? Because I thought those were government appointments as well. And so is there a correlation between the appointment of the trading post
Right.
person, whatever they're called, and the post offices?
Indian agent was the title.
Yeah.
And later, they're often called factors because they work in what's called a factory, even though it's not a factory as we understand it. The outpost was sometimes called that. What that gets to is one of the fundamental challenges, the spatial piece of this, which is most officials thank you. I'm sorry, I was distracted by Jennifer's comment. Most of the people in this, especially the civil officials, are located in identifiable and relatively precise spaces that had clearly defined boundaries, whether they're located in a locality that still exists or that we can locate historically. That worked pretty well. Counties work pretty well because they're pretty small spatial entities. Then there are several large, diffuse, there are several places where we don't know exactly where it was. And then there are spaces that have amorphous boundaries, and native history is where all of this comes up. We often don't have a record of where the outpost was located or the outpost moved over time, or the record is, it's located on the Missouri River near Jones's store. What am I supposed to do with that? And then the other challenge is there are all of these US officials, they're Indian agents, Indian commissioners, all of these who are usually assigned to a particular native people. And I generally don't use the word tribe because it's before the tribal identities or the tribal system as we know it now came into being. And then you got to kind of try, if you're trying to map their jurisdiction, you got to map out those people, and that's impossible. You can't do it with precision. It's best to have a kind of glob with porous boundaries because frankly, that's the way native polities understood their land. They had clear claims to land over which they governed, but sort of where they ended in borderlands. So that's been one of the real challenges. To me, it's the biggest spatial challenge of this project. The minister to Paris and the collector in Philadelphia, that's real easy to locate. There's an interesting intellectual exercise for what to do with a district court judge whose jurisdiction is over an entire state or a portion of a state. And that court usually meets sometimes meet in two locations. The district court for Pennsylvania meets in Philadelphia, and it moves either York or Lancaster.
Or a circuit judge who's riding circuit and going around from town to town.
Their judges riding circuit. And to show their jurisdiction, you've got to have a multi-state region. So the spatial dimensions of this, there's some that I don't know how to fix. Some of them are just interesting puzzles. Like they're not technology problems. They're really intellectual problems. Oh, and I should say the Army, that's the even bigger one because often the largest number of federal employees are in the military. And, I've got the enlisted personnel is a separate data challenge. I can talk about how one tries to do that. But at least for the officers, I've got this list. It shows every officer, when they move from rank to rank, and even what unit they're in. But where the 5th Regiment was in 1811 is really tough to do. Most of them are in the Trans-Mississippi West, And then during the War of 1812, they tend to be in clear theaters of operation. But beyond that, it's really difficult. My focus right now is to figure out where, in varying ways, I'm giving a very long answer to your question here, that some are located by locality, some by state, some by region. So trying to triage it that way. And then when you're getting to individuals, what jobs do they hold? How long do they hold them? And what kind of mobility do they have? Do people change jobs often? Are there opportunities for promotion? That sort of thing.
Thanks.
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Peter, I have a question for you. I'm just wondering, I think that you do a good job of capturing the complexity of taking this kind of like, non-data and making data out of it. And I'm just wondering, what have the reactions from your peers been to this project? Is there anyone who has just flat out disagreed with you and said, no, this isn't a good way of measuring this or whatever?
So there is one thing I will say is that the most heated debates about this go on in actually the literary fields, where you've got people doing the computational analysis of text, and they're running up against folks who tend to do close readings of individual texts, and that's a lot of argument. There is a long tradition of quantitative analysis in, among historians. Social history was born out of that. And, lots of people working with the census, lots of people working with other kinds of records. So no one has questioned the validity of the quantitative dimension of this. The conversations tend to be, how does this change our understanding of the early republic? How does this, and I run into two things. Frankly, for my period, a lot of people study political history, and a lot of their principal concern is with kind of political ideas and party operations, and they frankly can't. There are a bunch of us who are trying to convince them that these institutions and institutional histories matter. But most people I'm talking with are saying, first of all, this is answering a question that had never been answered. They feel like they finally are understanding what the federal government did and where it was located. My preliminary point that there is this measurable federal presence in the Trans-Appalachian West, that it's real and that it's there, matters. The other thing that they have found most intriguing is the way that, in fact, and I haven't quite worked out the answer to this, that people this period tend to see things regionally. How is New England different from the lower South? When in fact, I've made the point that to understand the federal government, a better comparison is to see Virginia and Massachusetts together, because they both have a lot of patronage opportunities. And people say, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't see that. So it's been okay. I have to tell you, these GIS demonstrations always dazzle them, and it's relatively basic GIS stuff. But every time I show that, people say, I see something I didn't see before. This is cool. The first piece of this just got published. It was basically all of my data on the Washington administration, and that was for an edited volume I was just doing. And the reader reports were good. So I guess that's a good sign. But when I write this, the book is going to have to be a narrative book. That's partly why it's about the federal leaders, because I want this to be a book that non-academics will want to read. The data crunching, that I'm going to do that in journal art. The next thing will be to do a journal article from this, because that's the right venue for it.
I just wanted to follow up with you about your book that you want to be more accessible to everyone.
Right.
So do you see any like types, like anything that you could put in like a data form, like a map in that book that you think that people would find intriguing? Because I feel like if people could see the narrative with some, interesting maps or interesting charts or, network analysis, that would be really like, oh, wow, this is really cool.
I agree with you. I don't know. I don't plan to visualize network analysis in this. But I'm definitely planning to use maps, a combination of literal maps of the type that we're familiar with, but especially maps like the ones I just showed. And again, the way I think about it is to write articles that can do the data crunching, so that as I'm also writing the book, I can tell one or two stories from that. Again, I think William Clark's going to be one of them. Thomas Melville is going to be another. There are a couple of these guys who are just clerks in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. And there's a story, there are a few of them about whom we actually have enough information to tell a story. But I can say it with confidence by saying this is typical, because I've then got my Smarty Pants article that shows, here's the average tenure in office and all of that sort of thing. So that's the way I plan to do it, that the book will tell stories, because if you think about it, most of the times you read a work of history, people will say, here's something that was happening. For example, and then they usually cite 3 examples, and those are actually usually the only examples they have. But by saying, for example, they would have you believe that there are actually hundreds of other examples at their fingertips. They almost never exist. Rather, it's kind of impressionistic from what people have read. My goal is to be able to kind of write the book that way. And that's, again, how these things interact. The data that's going into the website will be the same data I use for the article, so that someone else, if it's a scholar, if it's someone doing genealogical research on their ancestor, they can do that on their own. But it will also provide the kind of evidentiary backbone to the book. I got to write the book, and then the amount of visualization I can use will depend entirely on what a publisher will allow. I mean, that's what drives these things. The example I'll mention, then I keep thinking about, so the federal official, the person who had the most unique federal appointments during this period is John Quincy Adams. He gets more federal, it's not that he has more records, but he has more distinct and different jobs, because he's this globe-trotting diplomat. He has I can't remember, he's got like 14 nominations, for all kinds, for minister to this country, minister to that country, and finally Secretary of State. The person who comes in second is William Henry Harrison, who to us is kind of a joke, if you've even heard of him. He gets elected president, gives the longest inaugural in US history, and gets what he deserves. He catches pneumonia and dies 30 days later. But 30 years before he was elected president, he was one of the most important federal officials in the West. He's a territorial governor, territorial secretary, he's an army officer. He's both a junior officer in the 1790s and then a senior officer in the 18 teens. And after all that, he gets elected to the House and Senate. And he gets elected governor. Totally different view of this guy as this really important figure. But that's a story. That's a story that's supported by a quantitative data set.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
So what's the next step?
So
what is Bill going to do next?
Bill's going to have to wait, because right now I am finally engaged in what I call the grand disambiguation. And I'm starting with everything I've got from the Senate Executive Journal and the registers, and it is coming together. There are about 43. This will give you a sense of it. There are 43,000 rows in that spreadsheet. I've already done a preliminary run that's clumped a lot of them together, and I'm now in the process of reviewing that. We've got about 43,000 rows that looks like it will contain about 10,000 unique individuals. So you've got a whole bunch of them who show up in 10 different rows because they've got, they're nominated, appointed, and reappointed. And I've made it through 25,000 of them. And I should have that done in about a week. Then I need to do some final standardization. So, there's a kind of final review process I want to go through. And then a final run through. So I've already standardized their job titles and I've standardized the locations. And so once I've got all of that, I've been working with the Humanities Digital Workshop on how we build a website from this. And then I start working on the article. That's really the kind of proof of concept for this. Will this really deliver? Can I pull all of this together for the entire period, the entire scope of the project, which is 1789 when the federal government's created through you say 1829, I'm going to extend it like a year or two further. That's what I need to do next. Jennifer, have I thought about using story maps? You asked me that 5 years ago. The answer is the same as then. Yes, that's the next thing I get to do, which is start at the same time working on both the digital expression of this, which I want to do. It's a great way to reach an audience and do things I can't do otherwise. But also writing the article is important, not just because it's kind of the coin of the realm for faculty, but I don't want to write this. I want to write this for a journal that doesn't normally have this kind of computational or digital history stuff, because I want it to be a way to, normalize that in journals that are on the subject, that are on this subject or on this period. The challenge will be to figure out, how much illustration can you have in a printed journal? Do you have the print and then a digital corollary? But anyway, my goal by the end of this semester is to have the data, in good shape, to have the draft of an article, to either have the draft of an article or part of one of the narrative chapters. I think it will end up being the article, because that's what I want to workshop at the Humanities Center, because we all do workshops and they tend to be kind of standard humanities stuff. They tend to be close reading of textual information with stories told from that. I want to see if I can write something that tells stories through numbers that other humanists, only one of whom is a historian, only one of the fellows this year is a historian, that is intelligible to them. That's what's next.
Well, that sounds excellent. That was a very interesting talk, Peter. I'm intimately associated with the work that you've been doing,
yep.
And I still find it interesting every time I hear you.
Well, that's a good sign.
It's the scope and scale of what you're planning on doing and what you're in the middle of right now is it's daunting and it's impressive.
It's coming together. It's finally coming together.
It does feel like every time we speak, it feels like you've made incremental progress. You're moving on. So I think that's great.
Was this the kind of, should I just say, is this the kind of conversation that you all want to have at these gatherings? Am I giving you good, good conversation product here? Because I want to make sure this is useful for all of you and interesting.
Most definitely.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's real easy to think about numbers and, the quantitative data that we normally deal with that has hard locations and things like that. It's very easy to think about those terms and to communicate how do we deal with that sort of thing. This is such a squishy, messy process that I really think that this kind of perspective helps us all, look at things in different ways and get a little bit better angle on how things are done. So good. Anyway, it's been an interesting talk, and we really appreciate you coming and joining the data users group. We'll continue to invite you to future meetings in case
that'd be great. I'd like to come.
You'd like to join in.
I'd like to come as a observer or participant rather than anything else.
And that's a good segue to Doris to give us a little announcement about next time.
Yes, I'm going to put the link in the chat. But next month on October 26th, same time, same, probably different Zoom invite, but we will have Brad Averbeck, who is the computer systems manager for campus facilities. And he will be giving a talk about integrating drone imagery and survey data in enterprise GIS.
Wow.
Should be fun. Excellent. Well, and again, thank you, Peter, for presenting. Thanks everybody for joining in.
Oh, thanks so much for having me here. This was great.
We look forward to next month. Talk to you all soon.
Talk to you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.